glad you're along for this short little broadcast on YouTube. We're just excited to be able to give you an opportunity to listen to a little bit of what we do here at Cherokee. We just hope that you enjoy this, that it's a blessing to you. And feel free to leave a comment. Feel free to get in touch with our church via the website, www.cherokeechurch.org. From our website, you can listen to entire unedited messages. And if you're in our listening audience, you can tune in to 103.5 FM for Truth for Today that plays every Sunday morning at 8:30. God bless.
How great is our God.
You can open your Bibles with me, if you have them with you, to 1 Timothy chapter 3. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. As you can see, this morning the title of the message is Priority Mail. And no, that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I no longer work for UPS. I'm not trying to now encourage the post office or anything. But we're starting a sermon series this morning that will go on for the next few weeks that are all under this heading and this title of Priority Mail. And if you'll see there, you see that it's from Paul at P.O. Box 101 Mission Field, and then down the bottom it's to Timothy at First Baptist of Ephesus. And so we're going to be studying out of 1st and 2nd Timothy for the next few weeks, which are letters that the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy in order to encourage him and to direct him and to help him in his ministry at Ephesus. And we have to understand first that Timothy was the pastor there, that the Apostle Paul had started the church, that he was a missionary, that was his job, that was his calling on his life, was to go out to spread the gospel, to preach at different places and at different cities. And as people would accept Christ, he would start a church and show them how to worship and how to believe and start to lead them. And then after he felt like they had gotten to a point that was good enough, then he would appoint someone or ask someone to take over the leadership of that church, and he would go on and start the whole process over again. That was what he did. He was a church planner and a missionary. And Timothy is the person at Ephesus that Paul chose to take over his pastorate, that he chose to take over as the under-shepherd or the leader of that church. And then Paul, as he went off and was doing his ministry, felt compelled by God to write back to Timothy and explain to him some things about the way the church should be ran, about offices of the church and ordinances of the church and different things like that. And this whole sermon series started because I felt like a few weeks ago I was Timothy. I felt like I was that new pastor who didn't know what he was doing. And so I thought, well, if I don't know what I'm doing, where do I go? Well, if Timothy was the pastor and Paul was writing to him telling him what to do, so I went to Timothy and I started studying in 1st and 2nd Timothy, and that's where these messages have come from. I also recognized and realized that the more that I studied it, although he was writing the letters to Timothy and he was directing him, it was more that he was directing Timothy so that he could then therefore direct the people. These aren't sermons just for people who someday believe they're going to be a pastor, and it's not things that are just relevant for me. I believe that these things were intended for Paul to send to Timothy so that then he could therefore teach these principles and teach these things and outline these things to the people there at Ephesus. So that's where this whole priority mail thing came from. And we're going to see in the first point this morning why I decided to call this priority mail. And in the first point of the message this morning is found in verses 14 and 15. And we'll go ahead and read that this morning. It says, "These things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. But if I am delayed, I write to you so that you may know how you ought to act and conduct yourselves in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of truth." And we find the very first point this morning is that it's the importance of the message. And that's why I titled the whole sermon series Priority Mail, because I believe that the Apostle Paul, there in verse 14 and the very first part of verse 15, is explaining that this message is an important one, that these letters have value, and that he thinks that it is urgent and important that Timothy get these messages, get these letters, and then understand them, and then in turn share them with the people there at Ephesus. We see the very first two words in our text there, which is verse 14. It says, "These things," or "these things that I write to you." And when he says these things, we have to understand that that is an inclusive statement. That he's not just talking about the things that he is getting ready to write, or the things that he has already written, but he's saying these things as a whole. In other words, the entire letter or letters that I'm sending you, the entire group of things that God has shown me that I need to express to you are the things that I want you to understand. So we have to recognize that we can't just say that certain parts of Timothy are important to us, but we recognize that the whole part of these books are important, that he recognized there was urgency and importance in the whole thing. So we see there, when he says that, it says, "These things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. But if I'm delayed, I write to you so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourselves in the house of God." He says, first of all, I'm writing to you these things. I'm writing a letter. I'm going to send it. I'm going to put it in a little yellow envelope and drop it in the blue mailbox. And no, he ain't going to do that. But anyway, he says, I'm writing you a letter. I'm going to send it to you. But he also says, I hope to come to you shortly. That I hope to come and deliver this message personally, face to face, shortly. And we see there that there is a level of urgency and importance in that, because Paul says, one way or another, by all means, I'm going to get these letters to you. I'm going to teach you these things and put this information in your hands so that you know how you ought to conduct yourselves in the house of God. He says either you're going to get it in a letter, or you're going to get it face to face, or you may get both. He says, I don't know what's going to happen, but one way or another, I'm going to make sure that you get these letters. I'm going to make sure that you understand these principles that God has shown me, and the way that have to do with the way that the church should be ran and the way that we should conduct ourselves. We see that there's a sense of urgency in him, that if it was just a simple thing, if it was something that wasn't all that important, he would have just wrote the letter. He would have just sat down, wrote the letter, and put it in the system, and whenever it got there, it got there. If it wasn't important, he might have just said, well, at some point, I'm going to be traveling back through Ephesus. I don't know when, but surely I'll come back through. And when I come back through, I'll tell you these things. But that's not what he says. He says, either I'm going to come to you and tell you face to face, or you're going to get a letter. These things are important. And we have to see that whenever he says that I hope to come to you soon, that was a big deal. That these things were worth a face-to-face visit. That it shows again the importance of this message and the fact that he was willing to go and talk with him face-to-face. First of all, because we recognize that Paul's mission and Paul's objective in his life was to start new churches. His call and his mission wasn't necessarily to pastor churches. It was to start new churches, to truly be a missionary, and to start new works around the area. And so we recognize that it wasn't his normal thing was to go back. And we also recognize that it shows its importance because it wasn't easy to just go back. You see, today, if I need to give you a message and I say, well, I'm going to come to you personally, you say, well, that's nice that he's going to come to me personally and not call me on the phone. But it's not really that big of a deal for me to come to you personally. I mean, I have a vehicle that operates, pretty efficiently, and I can just get in it and hop in, and the speed limit is 65 miles an hour. I can be probably at any of your houses in less than a half an hour from my house. And, there isn't necessarily any threat of anybody hijacking me on the road, and the roads are nice, they're smooth, most of them are paved. Although a couple of them I went down the other day weren't so smooth, but most of them are smooth, and so it's no big deal for me to personally deliver a message to you. But we have to remember that for Paul, it was. Because the travel paths were dangerous for Paul. There was danger whenever he went. And whenever he was going to go somewhere, he had basically 3 ways to get there. He could walk, which sounds like a pretty bad option to me. He could ride a donkey, which sounds like an even worse option to me. Or if he had to cross water, he could get in a boat. And not Carnival Cruise Line, get in a sailboat and float. And I don't even know how they got there. I don't know how you steer a sailboat. The wind, to me, only blows in one direction. I don't know how that works, but anyway, somehow he could get there. But we see that it was an important thing for him to say, you know what? These words that I'm speaking, these words that I'm penning and writing down to you are important enough that I'm willing to risk my life, that I'm willing to put off the other things that God has called me to do right now. I'm willing to do these other things and give up my strength and my energy so that you can understand them. So we see there was a great level of importance. The reason I believe that this message is important to Paul is not just because it was coming from him. It wasn't that Paul had some false sense of importance in himself, and that's not what he's saying at all. I believe that he sees the urgency in this message because he believes in the importance of the local church.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our short little broadcast here on YouTube. We hope that it's been a blessing for you.